Hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ProductTank Lagos. My name is Zainab. I'm one of the organizers here, and I'm super happy to welcome you and introduce you to tonight's event. Yeah, I'm just waiting for this. Okay, thank you all for joining. So I'll do a quick intro for our first timers, and it will also serve as a refresher for the existing community. And then I will introduce our panelists, hand over to the moderator for the panel session, and this will be followed by a quick question and answer session, and then we close. So ProductTank started as an idea from a group of like-minded people in London, and it now operates in over 200 cities with more than 200,000 members. Like, we're literally the biggest, largest community of product people all over the world, right? And the intent basically was to hone our crafts and share and learn from each other as we journey into whatever chapters that we have. Khadija started the Lagos chapter in 2017, and since then we've had 4 meetups every year, except of course last year when we had the COVID situation. And I'm thankful that you're all here, our amazing community of over 3,000 people. There are fantastic volunteers that work behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank them. They're in the comment section. Say hi to them when you see them. And then I'd like to introduce to you Mark, who is our moderator for this evening. When ProductTank started, right? So when ProductTank started, Mark worked closely with organizers all over ProductTank meetups in over 100 cities. And what he basically did was try to ensure that we delivered quality at all of our events. He's a tenured product manager, and he has authored books, one of which we'll be talking about tonight, Managing Product, a call to manage intention. If you are as smart as I am, you'll get a copy very soon, and we'll be glad if you leave feedback or review on the book. Then I'd like to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. So I will start with Becca. Becca is a product manager at Fiit. Hi, Becca, one of London's fastest growing fitness startups. And then I have, sorry, I'm looking this way. I'm trying to look at my other screen. I have Caroline. She recently joined Photobooks as the Director of Product Innovation, where she manages end-to-end process for discovering, launching, and growing products. And then I have Eve. Eve is a product manager at Charlotte Tilbury Beauty, and she's focused on retaining customers through loyalty strategies and customer engagement. And I have Feyi. Feyi has had like an extensive career for about 10 years in product across 2 continents, and she currently works at Shopify as a senior product manager. And I have Tobi, who has over 8 years experience in the Fintech industry in Lagos, and he currently sits as the CEO of TeamApt, that is a reputable Fintech company in Lagos. Yeah, thank you guys for joining. I will be handing over to Mark now, who will moderate the panel session. And please feel free to drop your questions. They will answer them right after they finish the discussion, and I will see you all in a bit. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Zainab. That's for the lovely introduction, and thank you so much, panelists, for joining me tonight and talking a bit more about the tensions inherent in product management. Before we kick off our conversation, just to set the scene, I'm going to try and share my screen. Always exciting to see if it works, and I'll show you some kind of intro slides just to set the tone for the conversation. So I'm sure someone will start screaming at me if I'm failing to share my screen. Right. I don't hear any screaming just yet, so that's a good start. Like Zainab said in the introduction, we're talking about tension. We're talking about leaning into tensions that are inherent in product management. And before I give you a breakdown of what those tensions are, where they come from, what the challenges are of being a product person, I think it's fair to say that most of our reaction to tension is like, try to avoid it, try to pretend it's not there. But the gist of my book, the core premise of my book, is really about tension can be a good thing. Obviously, if you go about it in the right way, if you moderate it in the right way, if everyone's on the same page in terms of when it comes to managing tension. But there's 3 key steps that we'll be talking about tonight. One is acknowledging the tension. Again, accepting that there is tension in what we do, people we work with, the products that we work on. Second step is to analyze that tension, to understand where is it coming from, what's the impact of the tension. But then once you've done those first 2 steps, using the tension as an opportunity for growth, as a springboard. And the main reason why I believe that tension is an inherent part of product management is that product management, ultimately, when you break it down, comes down to 3 components. It's the mind of the product manager, of the people we work with, the customers. Matter, so what the product is made of. Obviously, if it's a digital product, we're talking about software code. But it could equally, if you're working on, let's say, a car, that's your product, then obviously we're talking about aluminium, we're talking about plastic. That could be the matter of the product. And finally, the moves that we make or don't make in relation to our products, or the decisions that we make, the actions that we take in relation to our product. And in my experience over the years, I've noticed how each of these components in their own right can cause a lot of tension, challenges, trade-offs. But think about it, if on a daily basis, we're probably combining all 3 components. So a recipe for a lot of tension and challenges. Now, like I said before, it's easy to pretend that those challenges aren't there, the tensions aren't there. But instead, I'm saying get comfortable leaning into tension, acknowledge it, understand, is there a tension? If so, what type? Where's it coming from? Is it a tension within me, within the team? Is it coming from our shareholders? Is it coming from customers? Is it coming from a product that we're working on that's not as flexible as we thought it would be? What's the impact of the tension, and how do I, as a product person or as a team or as a business, how do we respond to that tension? The second step that we'll be talking about tonight is how do you analyze the tension? So you've acknowledged it, you accepted it, it's there. One of the key ways of analyzing that tension is just the simplest thing you can do is to take a step back and saying, okay, what's happening here? What's the situation? What is someone saying to me? What is someone saying to me, or what's happening? And we'll talk about the step of going to the balcony and creating a moment of choice. Because when you're on that balcony, so you're literally taking a step back, or some people talk about stepping into a helicopter and taking a helicopter view and saying, what is the bigger picture here? What is this situation, this complication, this challenge or trade-off mean to me? What might it look like to others? And how would an outsider respond or make sense of the situation? And really think about it from a wise mind perspective, is what would be the best thing to do given the challenge or given the situation. And then finally, using tension as a springboard. So really using tension as a source of information. Once you've analyzed it, once you understand where it's coming from, what the impact is, use it as a source of information, use it as an opportunity to restate a problem, to say, okay, let's look at this differently, let's take a different perspective, see if you can respond differently, see it as a source of good, if you like, and take it as a source of strength. So one of the things I'd love to hear your thoughts on, apart from any questions or thoughts you might have as we start the conversation, is how do you respond to tension? What kind of tensions do you observe in your day job? Are you afraid of that tension, or do you make the most of it? And if so, how do you go about it? Are there any particular tools and techniques that you personally use to manage tension or challenges? And equally, how do you do that when you work with others and enable them or give them confidence to lean into tension? So with that said, it was a whistle-stop tour just to set the scene for tonight. I think I'm back and stopped sharing my screen. And this is where I'd love to get some thoughts from the panel, because I'm just curious, and Becca, maybe I'll start with you. When was the last time you experienced tension as a product person?
Ooh, lucky number one. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I think working in an early stage startup, I think tension is quite inherent, like in a lot of the day-to-day, it's very much make or break decisions that you're making. And so I'd say that it's quite common. And I like how in the book you mentioned that tension is neither good nor bad, but it exists and it's something that we deal with every day. So yeah, I'd say tension is quite inherent in my day-to-day, depending on what conversations I'm having and what initiatives I'm working on.
Feyi, when was the last time, tell us honestly, that you experienced some form of tension?
Oh man, I'd say just this week. I think in the book you referred to it as a knitting spaghetti tension, which is basically that tension between creativity and sort of an existing regulated industry. I work in a highly regulated, I'm building a highly regulated product. So you can imagine that there is the group of people who don't want to change anything because it just opens us up to all kinds of risk versus thinking about innovative ways to do new things. So yeah, I'll say this week, and that's like a pretty recurrent part of being a product manager, or part of doing my job on a daily basis.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Tobi, I hope you're not feeling any tension right now, but when was the last time?
Literally this week. I mean, one of the major tensions that I have in my role has to do with stakeholders, shareholders, investors, things like that. And literally the conversation I was having was with, I'm usually the startup guy. I usually start up new products. I'm usually doing research and things like that. And I started one recently. It's about 2-3 months old. And all the shareholder was interested in is, hey, let's take this to another country. And I mean, so that's all he's interested in, because he's seeing opportunities that are available in that country, but he's not seeing the fact that the product itself is immature. So the tensions I usually encounter the most are with the people involved in the product decisions, where everybody's seeing it from their own perspective alone. And fortunately, some of them may be extremely influential, powerful people who you may just have to end up dealing with every day. So that's one of my most common and probably my most frustrating tensions. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Caroline.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say, yeah, it probably is an everyday occurrence, but then equally, I think that's probably why I enjoy the job so much. I think it would be boring if there wasn't any tension. So I suppose mine, I definitely have experienced elements of sort of tension this week. I think as mentioned, so I'm 3 months into a new job at Photobox, so do photo merchandising in the UK. And what I'm finding fascinating is, so I lead a team that mainly look at physical products, and then we work very closely with the team that look after the digital side of products. And that's been a really interesting tension that I've been sort of facing into over the last few weeks around how do you get that right balance? Because when you're building new physical products in factories that require machines, you can't do that in 2-week sprints for obvious reasons. So it's really interesting to face into that and then try and look at how do you build sort of really compelling products, really compelling plans for those products, taking that bit into account. So yeah, that's been really interesting since I started.
Thank you, Caroline. I like how you call out that, without tension, job of a product person would be boring. I'm sure we'll come back to that. Eve, last but not least, when was the last time you experienced some form of tension?
Well, same as everybody else.
I think, as Eve started talking about, yeah, you're back. I noticed you start talking about tension and you freeze. Is that what happens?
Tension.
Exactly.
No, I was just saying that I agree with the rest of the panelists that it's a day-to-day thing for us PMs, and I experienced tension this week. I experienced it last week. I don't remember when I didn't. It comes in a lot of different ways. It can come from. I mean, I'm in a company that, you know, is really, really successful and is in a really good growth stage at the moment. And so there is always those kind of things about, you know, prioritizing what should we do now, what should we do next, what should we do later, and those kind of things. And that is something that is constantly at the forefront of my mind and can create healthy and unhealthy tensions, as you mentioned in your book.
Excellent. I'll make a note of that, because first of all, before we go into healthy and unhealthy tension, I want to just look at some of what does an ideal stakeholder look like? Tobi, I'm going to start with you. What makes a good stakeholder you can work with, you can collaborate with?
I think most importantly, it's very important for them to be open-minded. When the stakeholders come with a fixed mindset, it's usually extremely difficult to change their minds, no matter how good the argument you make is. But a stakeholder who is willing to listen and who's willing to actually see all sides of the argument is usually the ideal stakeholder, someone who's much easier to work with, someone who's a little bit too myopic, too stuck in his ways, stuck with what he knows works. Those kinds of people are usually a little bit tougher, or a little too tough for me anyway.
Anyone else, any thoughts on what makes a good stakeholder that you enjoy collaborating with?
I agree with Tobi. A stakeholder that's prepared to be open, prepared to listen, is a really, really great stakeholder. One that is really focused on data is a bonus. Use that as well. So yeah, just open ears is great.
And if we flip that bit, because it strikes me that you both, Eve and Tobi, you talk about listening. If we forget about the stakeholder for a minute, but for us as people, as product people, and we have to listen when we deal with people, you know, Caroline's example I liked, I'm dealing with the people, you know, as you mentioned, Caroline, on the digital side or the physical side, so we have to listen because it's too easy to say, and I've made that mistake to say, we're just going to steamroll them and we're going to do what I want, right? And go for the short term or what's important to me. What does active listening look like in your experience? Because it's easier said than done in my experience, at least. Caroline, any thoughts on that?
I think, again, because I've been through it, sort of having joined sort of a new company, I think the big thing for me, it's making sure that anyone, when you go into those discussions, that yourself as well, you go into that with a curious mind where you genuinely want to understand more about that person's world, about their constraints, about the challenges that they're facing, and then for them to, you know, reciprocate on their side that they're genuinely interested to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. I think as well, you have to go into those discussions yourself, not thinking I'm going to influence this person to agree with what I think, but I'm going to, you know, put my opinion forward, but I'm willing to change my mind if they give me some different data or some different information as well.
And on that note, I've just had a quick look at some of the questions coming in, and please keep them coming because that's really good. Because we've got a point here from Lydia, which I think ties in nicely with that point that you made, Caroline, about listening and understanding where the other person or persons are coming from is, and it's appearing on screen, is how can I fall in love with the product my team is building if it isn't an original idea or solution in a sense that it already exists in the market? So this sounds like to me like Lydia might not necessarily be convinced that we're building the right thing here. How do you, again, it's a slightly different way of like having empathy and trying to maybe accept it or think beyond that. And any thoughts for Lydia?
I suppose one thing I would say is still sort of thinking in its broadest sense about what you can do to make that a different experience. So actually, is it that you somehow differentiate in the way you market the product or the way you support the product, or there's something really interesting around the sort of the customer experience? I think there's usually always something you can do to add something that's a bit different to what is already out there. Or another thing that sometimes has worked for me is, you know, launching that potentially that Me Too product, but then getting yourself excited about what the future vision is for that product. So what could it become in the next 3 to 5 years' time?
I think you touched on an interesting thing there, Caroline, which is also a slightly different perspective taking and broadening that perspective. Has anyone got any kind of thoughts on how we can best do that as product people? Because it's very easy to, you know, be disappointed or think, you know, this is not going anywhere, or I don't believe in this, or I've been given a problem to solve, or How can you fit that in a way that, as Caroline says, you still look at the bigger picture, or you find a different angle? Feyi, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, like Caroline mentioned, first start by understanding what your own bias is towards like the product is. What is it that is sort of preventing you from seeing the 10,000 feet view of that particular product? Step back and sort of think about the product from different perspectives, from the perspective of the user, from the perspective of the engineers or the team that's building it, from the perspective of the business, and then start to get a new appreciation of other, I guess, adjacent problems to the problem you're trying to solve. And then it opens up new opportunities to think about the problem in a different perspective, and then you can start to build something that actually solves maybe not this specific problem that you started out with, but like based on taking a step back, learning new things, learning new perspectives, you're able to identify new problems that are worth solving, and then you go on from there.
Cool. Becca, have you got anything to add in terms of that perspective taking? You work in a fast-growing startup. I'm sure there's lots of different ways of looking at things. Things don't always go to plan. How do you change perspective and keep maybe a view of the bigger picture?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the things that have been said so far. And I think the only kind of additional thing that came to my mind is this question around, like, how can I fall in love with it if it already exists? And I think one of the questions that I would ask is why are you working on this? Like, why is your team working on this? What was the vision for their side, and how did they kind of agree to move forward with this? And then I think that's important as well, to help you understand what perspective, because then maybe you can actually get excited about it because you understand the real reason that it began in the first place.
Yeah, that digging into it a bit more. Switching gears a little bit, because I'm curious about, some of you touched on it when I asked you about the last time that you felt tension, that kind of role of being a product person where tension is a given almost on a daily basis. And I think that's partly due to our funny role in a way where, as I call it, you have to influence without authority. You have to get lots of people on board, whether it's stakeholders, customers, engineers, designers, but you don't have any authority over them. So you have to be really, thoughtful of how you take them on that journey. Have you got any tips or tricks of maybe do's and don'ts of how you take people on a journey? Eve, I see you nodding. So maybe if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I actually think that influencing without authority is probably one of the core foundations of being a product person, and it's our superpower. I think every great PM has it. The way that I do this is I do it by building really personal one-to-one relationships with everybody that I work with. Every single person in my squad and every single stakeholder I at least attempt to, I really put a lot of effort into doing that, because then it's a little bit like the products that I manage, which is retention, but it's about building that trust and therefore loyalty with each other. And it's then becomes something that's not so, there's no kind of like bland and grey and just a working thing. It's there is a desire and a passion behind people being motivated to do what they want to do. So I definitely think influencing without authority is, based on your ability to build really strong relationships with people and gain their trust and their respect through that as well.
Excellent. Tobi, you mentioned about that, dealing with lots of people as a obviously focus area for you. How do you build trust and build those relationships that Eve is talking about?
Yeah, so exactly what she said. You need these people. You need to build personal relationships with these people. And another thing I've also found that's very effective is to go from trying to get people to carry out tasks to actually discussing and coming up with solutions with these people. Because once people feel like they were part of the solution finding process, then they typically are more invested in actually getting it done. But it's a little more difficult when you just come and say, hey guys, we need to do this. Then it just sounds like something that the PM said they should do. But if we all thought through the problem together and we all came up with a solution, then they find it a lot easier to be more invested in it, as against seeing it as just a task that Tobi just came up with. Hey guys, we need to make this happen by next week. So I find carrying everybody along in the process of actually defining the problem and thinking through what the solution should be has proven to be very useful for me.
And how do you feel with that trust? Is there a risk of violating that trust? Like when you have to make really tough trade-off decisions, I always talk about our role as product people is not to make everyone happy. That's not our role necessarily. You might disagree, because we have to make tough decisions. Something has to give. And we have a question, for instance, from Toyin, who says, so how do you deal with the tension managing stakeholder requests and developers, as sometimes requests could lead to scrapping work that has already been done? So for me, and I'm contextualizing this question a little bit, where let's say you have built trusted relationships with both your stakeholders and you engineers, and again, that's part of our role as a product person, but you're presented with this trade-off where you might have to pause something that has already been built. Any thoughts on, for Toyin and others listening in, on how you can best approach that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always a why, right? Like even in this scenario that she's painting, there's a reason why we're stopping what we're stopping to do something else. And it's a lot easier to carry people along with the why than to just come and say, hey guys, what we're working on, we have to stop that, we have to start doing this. It's a lot easier when you actually carry them along as to why. Oh, hey guys, we wanted to do this, but there's this really great opportunity that we can't miss. It's time bound, so we need to pause this and come back to that. So it's a lot much easier when you actually just communicate and carry everybody along. It's when you just shield the information, kind of, when you're just busy assigning out tasks because you think that's what you're supposed to do as a PM. That's one of the easiest ways to lose your developers. But once they're involved, they understand why they're doing what they're doing. And it's a lot easier to actually manage them and get them on your side.
Anyone else has got any experience? I can see Becca with that kind of transparency and that kind of explaining why. Over to you.
Yeah, no, that was exactly the word that came to my mind. Is I think definitely bringing people along and being really transparent about all the decisions and the conversations which have happened up to this point, as to why, now one piece of work might be being stopped. I think also making sure that people are aware that you as a PM have also fought for the right decision. So, that you have communicated the right things that the developers would have expected you to communicate, and the designers. And I think that's also another really important part, that your team knows, because you built that trust with them, that they are doing the best for the squad, but also that you're doing the best for the business at the end of the day as well.
Excellent. I think one thing when we talk about building trusted relationships, and I talk about this in the book, is a model I came, or an approach really, from two guys called Bradford and Cohen, where they talk about building those trusted relationships built on currencies. So it's almost like you go to a foreign exchange kind of company, and you say, can I have this currency in exchange for that currency, kind of thing. But really understanding what the currencies are that are relevant to the people that you're working with or collaborating with. Because it was interesting what Tobi was saying earlier. So one of the currencies is around vision. And I've worked with a lot of people who will really go to move walls really for you, as long as they understand why we're doing it, what the vision is, what the problem is that we're trying to solve, if they can get inspired and behind it. But equally, I've worked with people over the years who say, vision is not something that makes me tick, couldn't care, doesn't really affect me, but they're more task oriented. So anything that we can do to help them complete a task, whether it's unblocking them or providing them information, helps to build that trust, because that's what they care about. So anything we can do in a genuine way, obviously, helps them to do that. And equally, there are people who are where status is a big currency. Again, might not be for everyone, but some people really like it if you can make them look good in front of their bosses or higher ups and give them an opportunity to shine. Again, as long as you do it in an authentic and genuine and well-deserved way, it can really go a long way to build a trusted relationship. So I don't know if you have any experiences with that kind of approach, where it's not one size fits all kind of approach, but you really look at the individuals that you're dealing with. I see Caroline nodding, so I don't know if you have any experiences or you've seen it working, or maybe not.
Yeah, I find the whole approach quite fascinating, to be honest, because I think it's how do you make sure you're aware of your own communication style and how you tend to communicate, but then being really aware of that other person and how they like to receive information. And I think some of it you can take blatant clues from the type of job they do, the function they're in, or just observing with them in meetings, like what are they talking about? Are they talking about financial KPIs all the time? Are they talking about the customer? What are their concerns? Those types of things. Depending how important that stakeholder is as well, sometimes it can just be really useful to speak to some trusted contacts that know that person well as well, to say, what does Dave like to hear about? What sorts of things is he concerned about? And then it's amazing how much you can then tailor your message so that it really does then hit the concerns that person has, and also just presents the information to them in the right way, because you're including the things that will resonate the strongest. So I think it can be very powerful in terms of how you then influence and work with someone.
Does building trust a relation on controversial question, does it mean that people have to like you as a product person?
I don't think they have to. Sorry, I was going to say I think they have to see you as being good at what you do and have respect for you. I'm not sure whether they have to personally like you or not. I don't know.
Feyi, I saw you. What are your thoughts?
I don't think trust is about likability at all. I think it's more about respect and just that understanding that they know that you know what you're doing, and when the time comes to make hard decisions, they can trust that you can make the hard decisions. So it's not necessarily I like this person's style of working. It's more I trust this person to always make the right decisions about the product at all times, and just communicate as frequently as possible when something is going either in the good way or in the other direction.
Gotcha. And going back to what was said right at the beginning in terms of healthy and versus unhealthy tension, and I can see a few questions that I think are worth weaving in. One from Nuruddin about, do you have any specific templates on how to, have a conflict almost? Tell us, let's take a step back before we go into that question from Nuruddin. Is one of you, I'd like to give an example of what you think is healthy tension, and I'm not going to pick on anyone, and one of you to say a real life example of unhealthy tension. I'll start. I've been in situations with teams that I entered into where the conflict and the tension was really around personalities. So it'd be like, oh, I don't like Tobi, and Tobi doesn't like Marc, and Tobi sees Marc as a threat, and I thought Tobi was really incompetent last time we released that product. And that is unhealthy because it was ongoing. And again, obviously Tobi is lovely, but you know what I mean? I've been in those teams where I really arrived and I saw people who it's kind of a toxic environment because that tension between individuals based on personalities and behaviors has been ongoing and hasn't been tackled. Now that for me is unhealthy because it's toxic, it's continuous, and it's not focused on an outcome or a specific task. Anyone else say, yeah, I've had that situation which I thought was pretty unhealthy?
I have seen unhealthy tension in like teams where there was very little trust. So just conflict between engineering teams and UX teams and product managers because nobody really trusts that everyone has a good enough understanding of what the product is or what the problem you're trying to solve is. So everyone sort of has an idea or an opinion is the better word for how we should solve a problem. And then it just becomes a tug of war. Where one person thinks they know they've been, longer tenure in the company or longer tenure on the product, and so they know the best about the product, and it just leads to terrible decision making at the end of the day because you're making decisions based on emotions rather than making your decisions based on actual data or understanding of the problem or understanding of the users. On the other side of that spectrum is really just healthy competition. Where I guess healthy competition is not the right word, just shared understanding of the facts that everyone is solving a single problem, regardless of your discipline. We're all solving a single problem. So everyone is working towards that direction without necessarily trying to get one up over the other person. And it's not a matter of one person sort of made good decisions, and so everybody else on the team sucks. So there's like complete two different spectrums of that same problem. It just comes down to trust and just a feeling of competition amongst the team.
And what's the thin line? And this is where we also talk about healthy tension, but I like talking about unhealthy tension and examples for a minute, just so we can then be constructive about it. Because there is a fine line, right? As you say, Feyi, in terms of being competitive or thinking, oh, I'm challenging Becca and my team, but Becca might be thinking, seriously, that Marc person is super annoying, right? And he's being really rude and intrusive and whatever. Where do you draw the line, anyone, between that kind of healthy tension that is focused on the problem and healthy competition versus unhealthy?
I think in terms of unhealthy, again, I was probably exposed to this early on in my career. I think it's nobody should ever be made to feel intimidated at work. And I think sometimes it does get that bad where somebody becomes so emotional about something they're trying to achieve, or it becomes personal about other people, where it can then lead to quite aggressive behaviour. And I think if I think about myself early on in my career, I just tried to deal with it and probably dealt with it quite badly. Whereas I think now, if I see that happening to other people, again, I personally believe that if anyone feels like that, you should just remove yourself from the situation, because so I just think it once it crosses that line, it's never going to be productive anyway, because it's just not good for anybody that's involved. And at that point, I think it's then how do you get a third party to come in and help with that conversation, or do you need to escalate it up a level, or various other things like that.
Caroline, I can honestly say it's a good thing that you didn't come across myself a few years ago, because I was that steamroller, and I talk about it quite openly in the book about, just with maybe best of intentions. That's at least what I keep telling myself. I was passionate, but I went in and definitely people were literally, like you used the word intimidated, definitely the case. So the question is, the question we had earlier from Nuruddin is that how can you do that, having that conflict or having that challenge in a more constructive way? Have you got any tips and techniques for people to apply? Eve, have you got any thoughts? And if you want to challenge someone without, Khadija said coming to blows in the office, that's the last thing you want to do, even virtually.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, it would never come to that. I would definitely run out of the room before it ever came to that. I think similar to Caroline, early on in my career, I've been in situations where there are people who are probably a bit intimidating, can get a little bit aggressive, and that's where you set boundaries. But as I've kind of progressed through my career and I've had growth, I've been in different unhealthy tensions where it is more of is there a blame culture going on? Is there a finger pointing situation happening? Is there a you're not doing what I want situation? And so it might not be on the level of aggression, but it is a level of no one willing to listen to each other's side. And at that point, the tips and techniques that I've learned is to really take a step back and be the person that can bring everything together. So as we were saying earlier with the helicopter view, it's like, okay, something's going on here. It's not going well. Let me stand above it and bring everyone together and just try to create some kind of harmony. And one of the really, really good skills that I've learned recently from my current manager is about framing. And so therefore, when you're speaking to somebody, framing that conversation of, I hear what you're saying. I understand you're trying to tell me this. This is the situation, and this is what I think we should do to move on based on this. And even if they don't agree with your approach, it then creates this level playing field where you can speak again on what can we do to tackle the problem and not fight each other. So I think that's one of the tips and techniques I can recommend there.
Anyone else who's really good at kind of constructive conflict, as Eve describes it? Tobi.
That's a very good point about, Tobi. That's a very good point about like stepping away from the personal and the individual to focusing on what the problem is. Just being shifting your focus away from the fact that this person is not agreeing with you, and just being focused on here's the situation on ground, here's the problem we're trying to solve, and taking that baseline instead of attacking, I guess, the person personally. I think another way to think about just that line, that tension line, or that thin line, is really trying to understand empathy, basically trying to understand where the person is coming from, stepping into the other person's shoes and understanding what they care about, that is making them push this perspective forward. Like stepping into those shoes just helps you see a different perspective, gain a different understanding, and then you can sort of solve the problem from a neutral point rather than this person is annoying, I don't understand what they're saying.
Yeah, I think you touched on such a good point there, which for me is one of the basic elements of giving and receiving feedback, just as much as you're saying, Feyi, is decoupling the person from the behavior or the situation. And often where it goes wrong in terms of unhealthy tension is we combine the two, and that's where it gets murky. I want to, in a few minutes, go to Q&A. We already have a lot of questions that we haven't woven into the conversation. So we'll take those, but I want, just very briefly, each of you talk about, as a product person, we talk a lot, we talked even tonight about the tensions, the different people we work with, things not going to plan, things being uncertain, whilst we all like a bit of certainty, and we work with people who like certainty. Have you got any tips or tricks of how we avoid, as product people, feeling completely overwhelmed and not knowing what to do with ourselves? For me, it would be and I talk about that in the book, the pause and taking a moment to really understand what's happening, stepping in that helicopter, understanding your position, empathizing with the situation or with the person that you're dealing with. But I'm curious to hear if you've got any tips for the people listening tonight. Is there a way to not completely feel overwhelmed as a product person? Tobi.
I keep cutting out Tobi, sorry.
No, Tobi has got, I'm just looking at the fact that he doesn't have his mic on, so maybe he's just thinking. Feyi, you go first, and Tobi is thinking about it.
I was going to talk about self-awareness, which you spoke about extensively in the book. It's like understanding for your own self, how a situation impacts you as a person. What is driving your reaction to whatever the situation is, and then sort of helps you basically make better decisions, because if you move at it from like everything is crazy, I don't know what to do, but you don't take stock of your own feelings, of your own emotions, of your own responses to whatever the situation is, and it goes downhill from there. So I think it starts from like being aware of whether it's the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty that's giving you an adverse reaction to the situation, or whether it's just fear of competition, or whether it's stakeholder difficulties, just taking stock of what's causing your own reaction, or what's causing your overwhelm before you sort of start to take a step towards solving the problem.
Excellent, thank you. Eve, how do you stop yourself from feeling completely overwhelmed all the time?
I think there's a few things that people can do to do it. I think in terms of just tensions, what I would say is you really want to be the person that looks in retrospect, that when everybody looks in retrospect at a situation that was unhealthy, you want to be the one that they say acted really appropriately and reacted in the right way to try and get through it. So try to think about what you want for your future self and be that person. And then how to deal with all the overwhelming things of juggling what seems like the world as a products person. I think the way that I look at it is I look at it from what's going to gain the most value, and whether that's short term or long term, and I prioritize, and I lean on the trust of my squad, right, of my engineering manager, of my engineers to help with the load and to push through. And hopefully, you're in great product teams, you can lean on them as well. But I think that's a good way through to try and manage with all the moving parts of being a product person.
Yeah. You don't have to, like you rightly say, it doesn't all have to come down on your shoulders.
Exactly.
It's a shared responsibility. Excellent. Becca, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I just actually wanted to build on what Eve just said, because I think it's a great point, like particularly for me, kind of in the last couple of years of my career. At the beginning, I felt like I had to have all the answers, and all the decisions that I made had to be the right decisions. And definitely something which I've learned is to really not be afraid to ask for help and support from your team, because at the end of the day, you're all working towards the same goal. And so, yeah, in terms of managing, it can be really overwhelming, but definitely not being afraid to ask and not feel like that makes you less of a great product manager. It's actually just a very natural thing for us to learn to do, because we don't always have all the answers, and we have to set an example to our team that when they don't have the answers, we can work together to find a solution. So yeah, that's the only thing I would add.
And I do think to add to what you're saying, Becca, is we definitely have a role as product people to not just us alone, but to really ensure that there's an environment where it's okay to be vulnerable and to say, I don't know, or can you help me with this, or what's the answer to this question? So no, thank you for sharing. Tobi, how do I stop from feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Becca said, I think product managers, I didn't understand this when I just started. The job is not to provide answers, but more to facilitate answers, because different people are coming with their different perspectives. The engineers sometimes have much better solutions than you can think of. And you don't have to feel like you're the one who always has to provide the answers, but the job is to facilitate those answers by having those healthy conversations that we kind of touched on earlier. Now, in terms of the tensions, I mean, so because they can come in different ways. So one of the things your book says is to actually analyze the tension that is actually getting you overwhelmed. If it's people related, then you probably need to think about the perspectives. Why is this stakeholder hounding me about this feature? Why are these two people finding it so difficult to work together, etc. If it's about a feature, then you need to analyze it. Why am I so scared of implementing this feature? Is it something I need to lean into, as the book says? Is there a gold mine at the other side of this tension? So one of the first things you need to do when you're overwhelmed is to, as Marc says, step back and analyze what is actually getting you overwhelmed. Once you've been able to analyze it, once you've been able to go to the balcony, as the book says, then it gives you, it allows you to come up with a plan to solve it. But if you just sit there stuck in your overwhelmed state, unfortunately, you're just going to get more and more overwhelmed. So sometimes you need to take a step back and analyze what is actually bothering me in the situation that I'm in. And once you've been able to analyze it, then I've found it typically gets easier from there. But it's easy to be stuck in that moment of being overwhelmed, just being there. And maybe that's where having other people, maybe that's where communities like this are great, where you can actually share problems with other people and help you get out of that hole that you're in at that point in time.
Excellent, thank you. Last but not least, Caroline, any tips based on your experience to stop feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I suppose so. Definitely when it's more sort of overwhelmed because you just can't see a way forward, so you're not really sure sort of how to deal with a particular problem. One of the things I've probably discovered more so sort of after the last few years is, again, sharing those learnings with other people in similar roles but in different companies. I think there's so many different tools, different models around sort of innovation and product management. It's changing all the time. It's so useful to speak to people in a similar role but a completely different company, just to share ideas and best practice. And I think people are usually really willing to sort of be quite open in those conversations. So I think that's definitely something that's hugely helped me when you sort of can't see a way forward.
And Caroline, if I can stay with you, and I'm going to take some of the questions, so please keep them coming. I'll try to pick as we go. But there's a question from Funanya, who says, how do we deal with tension when the work style is remote, as we all are doing at the moment? Because it's quite easy to misread communication through text or audio calls. Any thoughts on that, Caroline, and how you try to, again, when you have to communicate, you have to manage tension, having a one-to-one even remotely?
Yeah, good question. I'd say beware of Slack. I think sometimes Slack can be quite instant messaging. I shouldn't pick on a particular service. And I do it myself sometimes. I don't know if you guys do it, where you find yourself sort of in a bit of a back and forth, and they're probably misinterpreting what you're saying. You're probably misinterpreting what they're saying. And it always relies on one person to just get through that and say, can we just have a quick call? And then that other person's always quite relieved to say, yes, let's actually just talk about it. So I think I'd always say be careful of instant messaging. I think it's just, sometimes it's too easy, but actually it can be quite damaging sometimes if the other person misunderstands or think there's a loaded tone to what you're doing. I think the bit that I probably haven't solved enough is how do you make sure you have enough face-to-face time with your stakeholders without being on video calls back to back all day. So I don't think I've solved that one yet. But I am amazed at how video definitely is better than doing voice calls all the time. There's definitely something about seeing that other person's face where you can pick up on other signals, body language, etc. But yes, not as good as face to face.
And anyone else, any kind of tips from Nyanya in terms of, when there is tension particularly and you have to deal with it remotely?
I think one thing that I would just add as well is that retrospectives are really important forums for making sure that if you haven't, let's say you have 1 week or 2 week sprint and you felt that maybe the tension is kind of built up, make sure that your team know that, at the retrospective, that's where you can almost like lay it all on the table and proactively try and find a solution to make sure that, the next 2 weeks or the next week of work, that tension has been addressed. So I think, don't underestimate how important retrospectives can be for kind of getting it out and finding a solution together.
Thank you. I think if I can add to that, I've definitely seen over the last year or so, and particularly for those companies who weren't used to working remotely, I feel that whether it's voice calls or video calls, it has all gotten a bit more transactional. Whereas if you're in a physical environment, people are much more, they stand around the water cooler or they walk past someone's desk and they ask how you're doing. So I think it's also helpful whether you're in a situation of tension or potential tension or not at all, is to make sure that you do check in with people, even at the start of a call, or you create, to Caroline's point, moments where you don't even talk about work, but just see how people are doing and see what's on their mind. Thank you for sharing that. There's a question from Lydia who asks, and this is an interesting kind of tension or trade-off, if you like, where she asks, should your gut feeling based off experience, and we've got a lot of experience on this call, ever trump the data you have, especially when the data is a bit questionable, she asks.
I can go first. I believe in taking the data forward, but I also trust my gut. I will present both, and if I ever have a gut versus data fight, I immediately go to look at desktop research, industry news, what's going on out there, and then let that kind of steer me to see if to see which one I should rely on. So it is definitely an internal battle that happens. I guess it's internal tension within yourself that definitely happens, and it happens to probably all of us regularly. But yeah, I think don't just lean on data, also lean on your gut, but then also lean on what's going on out there in the world, what's happening, and keep your ear close to the ground.
I would say to that question as well is that, because it's very easy when you have data or you don't have data, or you have questionable data, to get stuck in an analysis paralysis side of things, and sometimes you have to go with your gut or your assumptions. The trick then is, if you do go with your gut, as you say, even if you don't have desk research, let's say, is how can I quickly get some data? How can I quickly learn? So you want to really, shorten that feedback cycle. Even if you start with a purely gut-based kind of assumption, say, okay, it's gut, I don't have data, but I'm going to allow only 2 weeks to get that data, and then we can iterate on that. Anyone else got any tips on that trade-off, building on what you've said?
I'll add to that to say, even if you do end up going with your gut or with questionable data, before you start whatever experiment it is you're running or whatever you're trying to build, set some tripwires in place. So basically, tripwires are basically what tell you that when this thing happens, it's time to stop and reevaluate the information you have, the data you have. So start off with tripwires in place. If this, then that. If this happens, we stop, we reevaluate. If this changes, it means we're in the right direction. If this changes, it means we need to stop and redo everything all over again. So in some cases, it might be fine to go with gut, even though it's not the most advisable thing, but set tripwires in place when you're using gut feeling.
Thank you. I've got a question from Betty, and Richards has got a similar question, but start with Betty, because Betty's asking, how does one deal with a group of engineers that believe the role of a product manager is useless, this has caused a lot of friction, and Richard asked something similar in my mind, because he's asking, what's the best way to deal with tensions as a product manager in an engineering-led organization? Any thoughts on that?
So I've worked in an engineering-led organization before, and it's really just one of those things. You actually just have to earn their respect. You have to actually provide value that they weren't getting before. You have to show why you're there, because if you're not able to show why you're there, then they will truly never respect you. And for the engineers, I mean, it may sound ridiculous, but sometimes it's just little things. Sometimes it's just showing that you kind of understand what they're talking about. Sometimes being a little too abstract as a product manager puts the engineers off, because you're almost no better than the business people as far as they're concerned. They're just coming here with wild ideas, and you are not really that deep into how we're actually going to get this thing done. So for engineers, I've found that earning their respect is very, very important. You absolutely have to earn your engineers' respect, and there are little things that you can do to earn it. And those little things actually improve you as a product manager. They're not just things that you just learn and they're not useful. They're things that actually improve you in your product management role. So you need to earn their respect. You need to figure out how to earn their respect. And one of the easiest ways to earn their respect is by being able to relate to what they're doing, not just, as I said earlier, just assigning tasks and saying, hey, figure out how to get it done. Think through getting it done with them, and they will start to respect you and see what you bring to the table.
Any examples of little things you've done, Tobi, or maybe someone else, to even slowly but that earn that respect and build that trust with engineers particularly? Because
yeah, so I mean, for me, maybe because I'm an ex-engineer, so I'm kind of able to speak the kind of language that they understand, and also sometimes actually just appreciating the work that they do helps. Sometimes we say things that can put engineers off, like, oh yeah, we can do that in 2 hours, and they're like, no, what are you talking about? I found just little things, being able to speak their language helps. Understanding some of the things that they use, understanding how they work, the APIs, Postman, little words like that kind of tend to get them to gravitate towards you a little bit more. Those are some of the things that have helped me personally.
Cool, thanks, Tobi. Anyone else? Any tips for working with engineers and gaining their trust or their respect?
I think one thing from a product manager who hasn't got a hugely technical background, but one thing that I've helped in previous organizations where it was a little bit more engineering led is taking them on the product discovery process with you, including them really early. That helps them to have a stronger buy-in, and therefore they feel more connected to you and they can respect the work that you're doing that they may not always necessarily see.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I think that's such an important point. I call it involving people early and often, but particularly engineers, because they like to know the context. They like to be involved in coming up with solutions. I've definitely made the mistake of promising something or thinking, yeah, we can do it, or testing it with customers, and then to involve engineers and finding out it wasn't feasible or I was too optimistic. Easily done, but I think you can prevent that from involving them early and often. And also, like you've said, is the empathy, that showing their interest. You don't have to become an engineer yourself overnight, but just understand the basics or being able to ask the right question, showing interest that way. I'm conscious of time, so we've got about, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, and I would say to people, keep coming with the questions. But in the absence of any new questions coming in, I've got a question for you, and it ties back to the question of how do you stop feeling overwhelmed? This is a critical word for product managers. It consists of 2 letters. What could that 2-letter word be? And I'm telling you, it's not rude. It starts with an N.
Saying no.
Thank you, Becca. How do you say no?
I tend not to say no straight away, actually. I tend to ask questions to better understand before anything else. I think also kind of putting trade-offs in perspective. So saying, if you want us to be able to do this, then are you okay with us not doing this? And I think really putting things into perspectives in front of the people that are asking you to make those decisions, I think is really important. But I think there's also a balance between just knowing whether to say no straight away and to actually ask a bit more information. I think that's the right balance which we're all trying to look for.
Excellent. Anyone else has got any do's and don'ts when it comes to saying no?
Yeah, I think you should always be able to say why. Why no, not just no. And one of the reasons that's very important is it also helps you identify when you're saying no because of one of your own biases. If you don't have a good enough why, then you probably shouldn't be saying no in the first place. So having a why to your no is always very important for me. And it also helps the other person because they know that, yeah, this is why you can't do this. Not just that this guy is a dictator or something like that.
Gotcha. Caroline, how do you say no?
I think it's just being really upfront about how you're prioritizing ideas and features, and just being really, really open about that. Especially because I've worked a lot in sort of product discovery or innovation roles. I think it's, especially in innovation, it's how do you actually set up a process where people are encouraged to feed in ideas, because obviously you want lots of good ideas, but then you make them part of that process when you're then prioritizing those ideas against certain criteria. And I find that when you do that and then you put it out to people and say, you know, we think it's these top 5 ideas, anybody disagree? When you've laid out your prioritization, usually the answer is pretty clear, and then people are happy to go along with that. Or as talked about earlier, it's how do you bring people in sometimes as well, some of that sort of co-creation session as well. It's so much easier then to get people buy-in to those ideas as well.
Yeah, definitely that transparency and that co-creation that we talked about. And we talked a lot about, you know, especially on the interpersonal front, you know, tensions with engineers or stakeholders or shareholders. But we've got a good question from Moyo, who says how to manage tensions between product managers or within the product team. And now you're obviously all going to tell me that you've never experienced that, and that it's not a relevant question, right? Because I've definitely experienced that. Anyone seen tensions coming up within their teams or among product managers?
I think it can be quite natural depending on how your product teams are set up. So sometimes I think, you know, talking about the biases before, about how some product managers will obviously always try to push their own agenda or the thing that they're working on. And I think that, yeah, I think depending on how your product team is set up, it can be quite natural to, you know, when it comes to prioritization and you have, you know, limited dev resource and, you know, you want your thing to get worked on and the other PM wants their thing to get worked on. I think it can definitely exist. In terms of how to manage it, I think it's a prioritization again, just like you would prioritize with your stakeholders, really making sure that you use data to inform the prioritization process, and just making sure that you listen as well. You know, why is one thing important to one PM? Like, bring them on that journey with you so that they don't feel kind of like, you know, you're just trying to get your way, and instead of them being able to do their thing.
Feyi or Eve, any experiences with, you know, tensions between product people?
No, you go.
Maybe one is just, I guess it just comes down to personality types. I mean, some product managers are super aggressive. Maybe aggressive is not the right word, but like are very assertive and push their agenda, their product decisions to things they want to do, in comparison to product managers who are more, I guess, passive or docile. I don't know if that's the right word. I guess I may have experienced that once. How to deal, on the other hand, how to deal with it. I think it really just comes down to open communication, proper communication between product managers, especially if you're within a product team or within a product area, or sort of solving similar problems, trying to understand what the person is trying to solve for at all times, and being able to find convergence points, or where like your interests sort of meet, or where you have shared interests or similar interests, and try to push the agenda forward, rather than just one person being assertive all the time and the other person ruling over.
Thank you. Eve, I know I've got a question building on that, because let's assume, you know, I like what Feyi was saying about these passionate product people, let's look at it that way, that might come across to someone who's more on the kind of, you call it docile, call it chilled, whatever end of spectrum. But, you know, let's assume I'm super passionate about my product. Actually, I've been a bit frustrated, Eve, because I haven't had it prioritized or hasn't had the love that I wanted it to get recently. And I'm super passionate, really passionate. I'm like energy, like, whew. You're like, no, I've got my priorities. I don't really see where you're coming from, Mark. And you're a bit like overwhelmed, no pun intended. And you think, he's quite aggressive, right? Because you don't necessarily get that passion because you couldn't care less about the product that I'm so passionate about. Have you got any tips for me on how I can best channel that kind of passion, that kind of energy, so that I'm not, you know, putting you off?
Yeah, I was actually going to respond to the initial question, saying something similar, because I think that perhaps ways that that there can be kind of internal product intention is by overlapping features in a certain area. Think of e-commerce real estate, for example. Say, for example, you've got 2 PMs who want to launch a feature on the checkout, right? That's tension. And I think for the person that's a little bit more introvert, not as loud and, you know, in your face, I think you have to be strong and silent, be the strong and silent type, stand your ground. And if it doesn't make sense to you, say why it doesn't make sense and duke it out in a really productive way with the other PM. I think some people are very excitable and some people, it's just people are different, right? But you have to try to get to a point where you can speak a really similar language and somebody has to listen. So try and do what you can to get them to.
Right. Anyone else, if, you know, like Eve was saying, if you were my manager and you think, yeah, I can see the passion is there, it's great, but it's not working. Maybe not even within the product team, but you're dealing with someone in marketing who doesn't get my passion at all for product or for customers. And not because they don't want to, just their focus is different. Any tips for me? Becca, how would you manage me other than sending me out of the door and saying, Mark, there's no place for you here? That's not an option.
I'm not sure, actually. I'm trying to think if there are maybe, you know, certain forums where you could bring that passion and you could bring that energy and channel it in specific areas where, you know, you have a place where you can talk about it so that you feel heard and you get to share it with others. That's the one thing that's come to my mind, but it's not, yeah, I'm not sure, actually, to be honest.
Caroline? How would you manage me, and so I can channel my passion in the right way?
I think, again, it comes back to that point I think we made earlier around, I suppose I'd want to work with you to see if I could help you adapt your communication style for different audiences. And maybe actually it'd be useful for you to get some 360 feedback from your stakeholders. And maybe sometimes that passion and that energy is working, and maybe sometimes for other stakeholders it isn't. And then working with you to think about how could you adapt that energy for certain audiences and maybe try a different approach.
Yeah, I like what you said there in terms, because again, it comes back to that, almost that stakeholder empathy mapping is tailoring it for different audiences. There might be people within the organization who love that kind of energy and it triggers them, but other people are like, ooh, this is a bit too much. Before I'll ask you a final question and we'll wrap things up, and I can imagine Zeynep might want to come in and to wrap things up properly. But before I do that, and before I ask my final question to you, I've got to ask a question for Eve to just clarify where Chibuzor says, what does strong and silent mean?
I think what I mean by that is being, if you're somebody that's a little bit more introvert, you're quieter, you're not someone that's going to go into a room and be the loudest person there. You still have strength in what you're saying. What matters is what's actually coming out of your mouth and not how large and not how loud you are. So as long as you're clear on what you're saying, you have evidence to back it up. It's coming from a space of, you know, sense. You can be that kind of strong and silent type where you're not always allowed. But you still have a really strong presence in a room, essentially.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. My final question is, and then I'll hand over to Zeynep, but if you could just really brief, because I'm conscious of maybe one word, one sentence, if you want. It was interesting because Anthony was talking earlier about, you know, the importance of interpersonal skills, particularly as product people. What's the biggest the most important interpersonal skill that you've picked up over the years that you value? For me, and I have to work at it every day. I have to be honest with you, it's listening. So that's my one word, listening, as a key interpersonal skill. Tobi, what's yours?
I think mine is working with people, like influencing people. I think that's the best way to put it. Getting them to trust you, actually caring for them beyond just the role that they're playing. I think that's one of the most important things that I've had to learn, not to see people as a means to an end, but as actual people. Yeah, that's what it has been for me personally.
Excellent, thank you. Hey,
I think similar to you, it will be active listening, not tuning out when people are talking, and just trying to go beyond what the person is saying to actually understanding what it is they mean by what they're saying. So I'll say active listening. Yeah.
Thank you. Eve. Eve is muted.
Sorry, I'm muted.
Yeah.
Rookie mistake. Yeah, this is the same thing. Active listening. Also, don't take it personal. So yeah, those two things.
Excellent. Caroline.
I'd probably say the other side of it. I think we talked about it earlier, but try and be the one with all the good questions rather than the one with all the good answers. I think just asking good questions encourages you to think about the problem in a slightly different way, and usually, leads to unexpected ideas.
Thank you. Last but not least, Becca, your one interpersonal skill.
I think it's about building trust, like a little bit what we came back to about those relationships and building trust. And I think that's really how you, ensure that you continue on that alignment and that collaboration with your team.
Cool, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing tonight. Before I hand over to Zeynep, I want to just, on my behalf at least, just do a big kind of virtual clap. And thank you so much for your answer, sharing your real life examples, answering some of the questions that have been asked tonight. Really appreciate it. So thank you. And with that, I'll hand over to Zeynep just to round things up really nicely as the official organizer. But thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. That was super awesome content. Thank you for answering the questions as well. So since you're not asking me, I'm going to ask myself an answer. What is that my one great interpersonal skill? And I would say it's knowing people on my team, knowing what their personalities are, like really deep. And when you understand people, you're able to relate better with them. And even if you have like, someone mentioned that you had like 10 people on the team and they formed this bond for years and you're just coming in, when you try to find out who they really are, you're able to better work with them. Nice. Thank you everyone for joining. The comment section was really lively. I like that people were even answering questions for each other. That was really awesome. Thank you so much. Quickly, I'd like to tell you all that our next event is on 26th of May. That is World Product Day. So stay tuned. We will share information soon and send you emails and be on Twitter and LinkedIn to let you know what that day is going to be like. So yes, we don't want to keep you all waiting. It's been a long day at work. Thank you all. If you have more questions, you can tweet at us at ProductTank Lag, and we will answer them as we think fit. All right then. All right. Bye everyone. Thanks.
Bye.